we both have believed that there can be a formal approach to our conscious experience. And I find this important, especially because we are talking about quantifying our conscious experience in phenomenology. So there is a basic assumption that we can use number or some kind of formal structure to represent our conscious experience. So at this point, I find Husserl's phenomenology very helpful because he is not only an expert in phenomenology, right? His earlier works focus a lot on philosophy of mathematics, especially the foundations of mathematization, logic, and formalization. So I hope that my talk today can shed some light on the fundamental issue of quantifying phenomenology as well. So coming back to my presentation, the basic research question of my paper is on the question of how we make sense of our temporal experience. For example, when I'm drinking coffee, right, a cup of coffee, I will have an experience of this drinking. But at the next moment, right, if I want to have a reflection, have a phenomenological description of this experience, then we are ending up in a new experience. And now we are focusing on the past experience of drinking coffee. So in the context of philosophy, we always have this problem of reflection, namely this reflected experience, it has passed already, it has elapsed. So at the point of reflection, at the point of description, how can we make sure that we can have an adequate description and reflection? So from this perspective, right, the problem of reflection is not limited to what we call the disordered temporalities or disordered consciousness. Even in our daily life, right, when we are talking about a normal experience, we can't guarantee that we can have a very accurate description of this experience if we do not solve the questions or the problem of reflection. So in this paper, I mainly use Husserl's theory presented in his Bernau Manuscript and written in 1917 and 1918. And the main thesis of my paper is that the idea of original presentation presented in Husserl's Bernau Manuscript stands for the recursive structure of time consciousness, which is fundamental to the objectification or formalization of our temporal experience. And this recursive structure of original presentation is also the root of normalization, formalizations, and objectivation, which Husserl used to talk about the foundation of logic in his project of formal and pure logic and his theory of manifold. So the main conclusion of my paper is that the Bernau Manuscript opens up a formal approach to the study of our temporal experience. Okay, so the first part, right, in order to understand what Husserl is saying in the Bernau Manuscript, it is important to understand his earlier phenomenology of time consciousness. So there is a transition from the concept of primal impression to the idea of original presentation in the Bernau Manuscript. So in Husserl's earlier phenomenology of inner time consciousness presented in his 1905 lectures, he construct a theory to explain how we can experience the passage of time. So according to Husserl, the experience of time cannot be rooted in this point like present. If we imagine the understanding of past and present is just a momentary representation, we have no way to make a distinction between memory, false memory, and imagination. So according to Husserl's earlier theory, and our fundamental time consciousness, we have this structure of primal impression and retention. So for example, when I hear a tone A at a certain moment, this tone A will elapse right in the next moment, but it will not disappear in our consciousness because we will have a continuous retention of this past experience to a modified impression A prime. So according to Husserl in this theory, the primal impression is the origin of our conscious experience and temporal experience. So this is what he says in this lecture. The primal impression is something absolutely unmodified, the primal source of all further conscious and being, and primal impression has as its content that which the word now signifies, insofar as it is taken from the strictest sense. So according to this theory, where all our conscious experience are stemming from this unmodified moment of the present, or our experience of the present now. But this theory have a limitation, right? Because if we have some reflection of our temporal experience, right? When we experience some temporal object, right, like a melody, right, we do not have the awareness of this melody only when the whole melody elapses or pass into our retention. So this earlier theory cannot encompass the dimension of protension or the future. So in the Bernau Manuscript, Husserl present a more mature theory of time consciousness in which he adds the dimension of protension, which is represented by the vertical line on top of the original time diagram. So according to this new theory, then, right, in the present moment, when we have a conscious experience of something, we do not have the unmodified impression, because at this moment, when something is given as an eidetic datum, right, this experience is not unmodified, but it is already entailed the protension of a future E prime based on the temporal form of the object. So for example, at the time point E2, right, I hear a piece of melody. So I do not just have the primal unmodified impression of this tone, but according to the temporal form of the melody, I will have a protension or expectation of what tone I will hear in the next moment. And if this turn out to be fulfilled, right, in the next moment, I will have a new presentation, right, or a new perception of the melody. So this is what Husserl means by original presentation in the Bernau Manuscript. So it is different from the primal impression because, right, this is the entering point of the process. The point of original presentation is already passed into retention, right, the moment when we have the awareness of our conscious experience. And he also used this chain of fulfillment to explain how the eidetic data of our experience can change, right, in the continuous process of modification. So when we have the experience of E0, right, it is not just an unmodified impression, but it is a result of a continuous process of fulfillment all the way from EK plus 1. So according to this model, right, then our original presentation, right, is not an unmodified point, but at every time when we have a self-awareness, aware of our own experience or aware of the present, this is already a kind of objectification or modification. So the problem is, how do we make sense of this new theory, or is this theory reasonable? So Husserl theory in this Bernau manuscript is very controversial, and Professor Dan Zahavi especially criticized this theory in his work published in 2004. So according to Zahavi, a problem of Husserl's theory in the Bernau manuscript is that it committed what he called the internal object interpretation. So according to this interpretation, right, it is a thesis that the conscious act or experience are regarded as an act object just opposed to a more originary time constituting consciousness. In other words, we can have an awareness of our conscious experience or make sense of our conscious experience only when the experience itself is being objectified. So according to Zahavi, this will end up in the problem of infinite regress, because when we talk about an experience, it entails the reflection of this experience and then the reflection of this reflection, etc. So this, according to Zahavi, this is a chain of infinite regress. So according to Zahavi, he rejects Husserl's theory in the Bernau manuscript, and he proposed what he called the first level theory of consciousness. So he says the first person givenness of experience should not be taken as the result of any higher order representation, reflection, internal monitoring or introspection, etc. Right? So this is the controversial point of Husserl's theory in the Bernau manuscript. So here we can see the juxtaposition of the two theory. On the one hand, we have Zahavi's one-level theory of consciousness, which claim that we can have the pre-reflective self-awareness of our conscious experience. And on the other hand, Husserl present in the Bernau manuscript that our original presentation or the original apprehension of the core of this hypothetic data of our experience is already a kind of modification, or what he called the objectification. So in a sense, our conscious experience at the moment it entered our stream of consciousness has already been modified or being objectified. So my reply to Zahavi's criticism is that Husserl here is not committing the problem of infinite regress, because what he tries to present in this theory is how a conscious experience can be objectified. So in other words, Husserl does not state that the first experience is possible only if or only when it is grasped objectively, but rather he asserts that this experience can be modified and objectified while preserving its identity. So this can be seen, right, in the chain of fulfillment that we just mentioned. When something is being given to our consciousness, right, it is not just an unmodified impression, but it is coming from a chain of modification. And from this recursive or reiterative structure of consciousness, he also presents how we can have reflection of our past experience. So in this diagram of reflection, Husserl made a distinction between two dimensions of reflection. One is focusing on the experience, E1, E2, E3. That means what we really experience at each different time. But on the other hand, we can also experience how an object or a piece of experience is modified and changed in the original process of our consciousness. So my proposal is that what Husserl is doing here is to make use of this recursive structure or reiterative structure to talk about how an object or a temporal experience can be modified again and again to a higher level. And because of this recursive structure, right, it also doesn't matter whether our experience is modified or not. Right? For example, at the moment we experience something like this cup of coffee, it is already a result of modification after, for example, lambda state. So it doesn't change the fact that we can still grasp the objectivity of this cup of coffee, because any further modification, like V count, when it is at upon this point, it can result in the tau plus lambda state of modification of this original E. So this is my interpretation of Husserl's theory of time consciousness and this recursive structure of original presentation in the Bernau manuscript. And the next question is, why did Husserl present this new theory, and what is its application in understanding the formalization and objectification of our conscious experience? So this question can be traced back to Husserl's very original philosophical commitment, that is to discover the foundation of mathematics and logic. So back in his logical investigations, he has already proposed the idea of manifold. So the idea of manifold is defined as the objective correlate of a concept of a possible theory, definite only in respect of form, and is a concept of a possible field of knowledge over which a theory of this form will reside. So he gives a particular example, right? Like this manifold of the objective space. So Husserl says the manifold of the space is no longer the manifold of points in the original sense. There's no longer any talk of space at all in mathematical geometry. So before the formalization, for example, we will have this intuitive understanding that there are 2 points determine a line, right? But in mathematical geometry, after the formalization, the worst point, straight line, angle, intersections, all these concepts are being empty signs. So an example is the neutral geometry, which building up the idea of a manifold using the 4 axioms. 2 points determine a line, all right angles are equal, a line can be extended indefinitely, and any center and distance determine a circle. And this formal system can later be interpreted into different fields like the elliptic geometry, Euclidean geometry, or the hyperbolic geometry. So this idea of manifold is a kind of formalization to a universal level of theory such that a theory can be applicable to different fields. And according to Husserl, this process of formalization can be done when we extract from the judgment that 2 points determine a line to the logic of non-contradiction, in which we consider the consistency of the logical connection between these statements. And this process of formalization and nominalization is possible only when we move beyond the statement S is P, and we now take the whole statement as an object. So we have the modified judgment as the fact that S is P, or simply that S is P has a consequence, etc. So according to Hartimo, right, this kind of formalization or nominalization, right, is coming from the reiterative structure of the judgment. So now we can see the parallel structure between Husserl's idea of original presentation in the Bernau Manuscript and the idea of formalization and nominalization, which he presents in his pure logic. And with this comparison, we can say that the reason why Husserl developed this theory is that only when such a kind of recursive procedure is possible in our consciousness can we formalize the higher level structure of logic, formal ontology, and eventually his idea of the theory of manifolds. And because of this, right, we can also compare how the process of formalization can be applied to formalize or objectify our temporal experience. So as I said, right, in the formalization of the manifold, a core point is to figure out how these different judgment and statement can be formed in a judgmental synthesis according to the logic of non-contradiction. So the problem for the manifold of consciousness is how are these conscious experience being synthesized? So going back to Husserl's Bernau Manuscripts, so there can be two dimensions of this synthesis. So on the horizontal line, when we are talking about the subjective experience moment after moment, so this is the original process of time consciousness, which later Husserl explained through the concept of passive synthesis in the passive synthesis lecture. And in my work, I focus on the vertical line, which is the temporal form of the temporal object. And in the Bernau Manuscript, Husserl explained this synthesis through the idea of temporal situation. So what is a temporal situation? In summary, it is a situation in which two events or object can be related according to a temporal order. So this is what Husserl says, right, in the Bernau Manuscript. He used a negative example. So he says the center that I now fictitiously have and the hippo that I previously imagined lack this time situation. And this is to say that the quasi experience does not have one another object, as the case in a real experience, in which they stand in a manifold continuum of experience, in which a unique time is constituted as the temporal form of all perceived and perceptible objects. Or we can use another more lively example, right? Like the final snap, right, as an event in the Marvel universe, and the death of Voldemort in the universe of Harry Potter. The two events will lack a common time situation to synthesize the two events. So the two events will lack a common temporal situation. So using this idea of temporal situations, we can actually draw the formal connection between two events, right? For example, comparing the experience of drinking a cup of coffee and the experience of working as a project manager. So it makes no sense to say that when I was drinking a cup of coffee, I became a project manager. But on the reverse, it makes sense to say that when I was a project manager, I drank a cup of coffee every day. So this is an example to show how we can use a temporal order to define a meaningful or reasonable temporal situations. And this exactly will fit in the recursive structure of the original process of original presentation. For example, the first modification of the experience of coffee is the experience of drinking. And in the next moment, I can further objectify it in the context of me being a project manager and drinking a cup of coffee being my habit. So in this kind of modification, I'm not talking about the actual reflection of that past experience, but whether this experience can be formalized in a broader whole, meaningful whole. So topologically speaking, when we compare two different events or two conscious experience, there are four possibilities. Either A and B have no common situation, or event A is the time situation of event B, event B is the time situation of event A, or there is a common time situation C that render the temporal order of A and B. So for any moment of our conscious experience, we can draw the corresponding temporal situation, so we can end up in the topology of the temporal situations. So this is a concept I modified from what I earlier called the nested model of time I presented 3 years ago. So beyond the stream of consciousness, right, actually we can describe how the change of these temporal situations occur at different moments. For example, at this moment, right, I have certain experience of drinking a coffee, then I can describe it against a temporal situation. And in the next moment, if I have a new piece of experience, perhaps these two experiences do not have a common temporal form, but we can try to formalize it in a way such that we can find the common temporal situation which can explain the temporal order between these two pieces of experience. So in other words, right, the way of formalizing our conscious experience is to determine this temporal form, or what Husserl says, right? It is to identify the essence of the individual temporal object according to all its constituting moment. And this is related to the temporal form and according to Husserl, this temporal form, it contains nothing present, past, or future. This temporal form, right, is what he calls rigid temporal form, which does not flow. So the possible way, or a possible way of formalizing our conscious experience, is to identify these temporal forms so that we can construct the temporal situations to determine the formal relation between different moments of our conscious experience. And from here, we can actually have different temporal form, right? We can have, or using the term of Paul Ricoeur, we can have different plot or different narrative to make sense of our temporal experience. Or in terms of logic and mathematics, we can use different scientific theory or axiomatic theory to determine the temporal order. So the linear timeline that we used to have, right, in traditional science and mathematics is not the only temporal form that we can use. So I hope that from here I can shed some light on some possible way to formalize our conscious experience and further have a comparison between the constitution of our conscious experience and those formal structure and mathematical structures. So a brief conclusion is that the idea of original presentation in Husserl's Bernau Manuscript stands for the recursive structure of time consciousness, which is fundamental to the objectification and formalization of temporal experience. And the recursive structure of original presentation is also the root of nominalization, formalization, and objectivation in Husserl's formal logic and theory of manifold. So similar to the formation of manifold in Husserl's pure logic, the recursive structure of time consciousness in the Bernau Manuscript also enable the formalization of conscious experience by constructing the temporal order of different temporal situations of our conscious experience. So I believe, right, under this, we can have more different approach to the quantification or the mathematization or formalization of our conscious experience. So that's all of my presentation today. Thank you for your patience and attention.